Good evening to all. This is our fourth and final lecture with the title, again, Stranger, Neighbor, Citizen, Polish Jewry in History and Historiography. And this time we're going to return once again to the interwar period, but we're going to focus on one particular sector of Polish Jewish society, and that is the Orthodox sector, which in many ways was the most threatened by the rapid changes that were taking place since the beginning of the 20th century. Big changes such as immigration, urbanization, moving from small towns to big cities like Warsaw, where people's roots were no longer there. And they had sometimes difficulties adjusting to the big city. And one of the ways of adjusting, as they saw it, was the abandoning of religious tradition. We mustn't forget also the suffering and dangers and also the displacement that took place during World War I, when literally millions of Jews fled from their homes, either east into the interior of Russia, where they had not been permitted to live before, and hence there was no real infrastructure for religious life, and millions others fled west to Vienna and other places in the Austrian Empire and spent the years of the war there, and only afterwards came back to Poland. And when we say they came back to Poland, not all came back. And most notably, many of the Hasidic leaders, the Rebbes, actually stayed on in Vienna for many more years, and they were in a sense cut off from direct contact with their followers, which of course had a big effect on what happened to Hasidism in the interwar period. But we're going to focus again on what happened in the interwar period. And I called this last lecture to enlist the enthusiasm of youth. Orthodox Jewish non-political responses to the challenges of interwar Poland. How do we talk about this period? What is the narrative? And we've done this in all of our lectures, talking about narrative versus reality and the connection between them. What kind of narrative? How did people talk about themselves in the period? And how do historians in later generations talk about the period, and in this case, the religious sector? So first, there is a narrative of secularization and religious decline. And here I'd like to cite the very fine autobiography, memoir of Rabbi Ben-Zion Gold, who later came to America and became the Hillel rabbi in Harvard for many, many years. His Life of Jews in Poland Before the Holocaust. And he says here, I grew up during the late 1920s and early 1930s. In those years, about 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland, but less than a third of them were religious. Here, as I said, the question that people always ask me in public lectures, how many Jews were religious? Rabbi Gold gives a figure of about a third. Most young people of my generation abandoned religion for political or practical solutions to the dilemmas of Jewish existence. They were attracted to Zionism, to the Jewish Socialist Bund, or to communism, the groups that were competing successfully for the allegiance of the younger generation. And it's hard to exaggerate the attraction of these various political ideologies for young people who saw no hope, whether economically, socially, or otherwise, in Poland as it was. But for Rabbi Gold, he says, what sustained me was my religious upbringing. And another very moving example of this narrative of secularization and religious decline, we have in the words of the Rebbe of Piaseczna, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalmish Shapiro, who in one of his books, which were published posthumously, he said that there are houses in which the father returns from the mikveh and from prayers on Friday evening dressed in his Shabbat clothes, wanting to awaken and be enthusiastic with the holiness of the Sabbath in recitation of the Kiddush, while at that same moment his son is smoking a cigarette, God forbid, or reading from a book, from those licentious books that make the body and soul impure, God forbid. Or the young men discuss the filth that they read or saw in the theaters, or some of them leave the pure Israelite house and go to the theater to sin and dirty themselves and the entire people of Israel. And the father sees this, and his heart contracts, and his thoughts are weakened. So a kind of dramatic presentation. But another thing that comes from this quote and many others is a certain passivity, which seems to characterize the reaction of the older generation to what was happening in the younger generation in the field of secularization and abandonment of religious tradition. And there's another narrative which is related, the narrative of threat and danger. And the way this danger had to be met was not just with passivity, but what we could call catch-up or Me Too, not the Me Too of today, but we can do what the Zionists can do, with youth movements and politics at the center. And again, it's hard to overestimate the impact that the youth movements had at this period on young Jewish people in Poland. But besides that, there was politics, as we said. So here we have two, again, election posters. One on the eve of the Kehillah elections in Lodz, and it talks about the Lodzer unparteiische religiöse Juden, the non-partisan Lodz religious Jews. That is, those who are not affiliated with Agudat Yisrael. They urge people to vote for their list in the Kehillah elections. And the poster we saw last time, that all strong religious Jews vote for the list of Agudat Yisrael. And youth movements also. There was a certain amount of copying, Me Too. The youth movements were attractive, so let's have Orthodox youth movements as well. So on the right, you have the Hashomer HaTzair group in Ostrog from 1921, and an undated picture from Radomsk of the Tzirei Mizrahi, the young Mizrahi, and Hashomer HaDati. So there was Hashomer HaTzair, and there was Hashomer HaDati, the kind of religious equivalent of the scouting movement and the pioneering youth movement looking towards Aliyah. And another part of the narrative of threat and danger was the competing school networks. Nothing could be more basic to the training of the next generation than Jewish education. And Jewish education and education in general underwent a revolution in interwar Poland. When Poland set up a universal system of schooling with compulsory education, one could not just go to cheder as they did in previous generations. And therefore, we find both Jewish school networks, such as the Sisho school network, which was the Yiddish-based, leftist-based school network, or the Tarbut organization, which had both, here we see Shiurei Erev, evening courses in the Hebrew language, particularly for those interested in moving to Eretz Yisrael. But the Tarbut organization also sponsored a whole network of schools, of elementary and high schools, which were taught mostly Ivrit be'Ivrit, and offered a challenge to traditional Jewish education. And Agudat Yisrael would set up its own school system in that period, a series of elementary schools for boys that were called Yesodei HaTorah. And with, I guess, a glance toward today's political disputes in Israel, Agudat Yisrael, in order to achieve government recognition of its school system, had to agree to curricular changes, which included a significant percentage of secular studies, such as Polish language, Polish history, mathematics, science, art, gymnastics, etc. What we call here in Israel kursei liba, with Aguda politicians today in Israel fighting tooth and nail against any such changes in their school system. But in Poland, Agudat Yisrael had to face the reality of the Polish school system and the Polish compulsory education law. And in order for their schools to be recognized as fulfilling the demands of the compulsory education law, they had to have these changes in curriculum. And of course, there was the narrative of threat and danger, the challenge of the Polish public school, which, remember, was free for the first 7 grades at least, whereas in Jewish private schools, parents had to pay tuition. And of course, it was a tricky thing to speak against sending your children to the public school. What you could say, such as an example here, this open letter by the rabbi of Siedlitz, who urges parents to sign up their daughters in the local supplementary Beis Yaakov school. In other words, the rabbi realizes this is a reality, that most Jewish children are going to go to public schools, to Polish public schools. But, he says, girls must have basic religious education, and the way to get that is in the Beis Yaakov school, which was set up in his town, which again was supplementary. They went to the Beis Yaakov after studying in the public school. And I went back, excuse me. But there is a parallel narrative of how the religious sector dealt with these challenges of ideological competitors, of government schooling, of secularization in general in society. And it's what I call creative conservatism in its struggle with modernity. And there are various ways in which the Orthodox sector did this, which we could call here an outline: ideological reframing, institutional realignment, institutional innovation, what we could call missionary zeal and enthusiasm, and even theological innovation, as surprising as that may seem. One of the major changes which took place in this supposedly most conservative of sectors of Jewish society was a new conception of children and young people as Hasidim. And so the Gerer Rebbe, who was known as one of the leaders of Agudat Yisrael and had seemingly the largest Hasidic group in Poland in those days, he set up a whole series of what we could call, very correctly, youth movements. Youth cadres with a commander, there was some kind of organization, shtibels, where youth could pray, a kind of separate youth existence, and also a realization that there was a necessity for a specific Hasidic training as part of Jewish education. One cannot depend only on the atmosphere, the Jewish street, as we called it the last time, because the Jewish street was not broadcasting one message, the message of tradition, but rather a series of competing messages. And the Gerer Rebbe, who was connected, as we said, one of the leaders of Agudat Yisrael, also gave a hesitant endorsement to the Tzirei Agudat Yisrael youth movement, which he said, I don't like the idea of taking boys away from the yeshiva to spend time in the youth movement, but is it the choice of nothing or the youth movement, then it's better that they go to the youth movement. And there's one clarification I should make here. When we think of youth movements, we think basically of teenagers. But in Poland, the youth movements could include people from the ages of teenagers, but into their mid-20s and even later 20s. And they still could be part of youth movements. And there was always an argument within the political parties, when will the youth move into the adult party? And some of the youth leaders liked being leaders, and they didn't want to start all over again, so they stayed in the youth movement as long as possible. But this notion of children and young people as Hasidim is something which is new and which is testified both visually here, as young Hasidim brought by their father to the Gerer Rebbe's court in 1926, and a statement which has been quoted again and again by the Sokolova Rebbe, who said admiringly that the Gerer Rebbe has 10,000 Hasidim who don't wear tefillin and don't fast on Yom Kippur. Of course, they don't wear tefillin and don't fast on Yom Kippur because they're not old enough. But these are Hasidim, full-fledged Hasidim in the view of this interwar period. Here's another picture of young Gerer Hasidim arriving at the Rebbe's court. And we find this in memoirs, people talking and noting this special change of recognizing young people as full-fledged Hasidim. So here this quote from someone's memoir: when they started to bring near the young men, there traveled a minion of young men from Warsaw to Gur for the entire Sukkot festival. On Simchat Torah, the Rebbe bought a hakafa and honored all the young men. This caused a sensation. Since in the days of Sfat Emet, who was the Rebbe until the beginning of the 20th century, nothing was, oh, whoops, I got to go to the next slide. Nothing was done to draw near the young men. Then they were not even allowed to stand in the line. That is, the line of Hasidim who crowded together at the time of the holy table, the Tish, around the table in order to gaze upon the holy countenance of the Rebbe. As opposed to this, in the days of his son, the Rebbe of blessed memory, there were young men who stood also in the first row. There's encouragement of the youth, drawing the youth near, realizing that they were the future, and this was the battleground over the youth. We said last time that Jewish politics in Poland was not particularly successful on the external level in trying to achieve policy goals. But on the internal level, Jewish politics was a struggle, ultimate struggle over particularly the young people. And there was another change about Hasidic life in the interwar period, and that is the growth of Hasidic Yeshivot. Now, my friend Shaul Stampfer has written about Hasidic Yeshivot, and he wrote how there were some founded already in the decade before World War I. But almost all of those yeshivot were closed during the war years and had to be renewed and rebuilt after World War I. And this was something new, as Rabbi Gold, again in his memoir, says, remembering his hometown of Radom. When I was growing up during the 1930s, the Beit HaMidrash was used mainly for morning and evening prayers. And only one of the 20 shtibels in Radom was frequented by young Talmudists. The others were used for daily and Sabbath prayers and stood empty the rest of the time. Here and there, one would encounter a young scholar on kest, that is, being paid by his in-laws to study for a few years after marriage, spending the day studying in a shtibel. Now look at what he says. What had recently been the norm became in my time an exception. In cities with large Jewish populations, such as Warsaw and Lodz, one could still find shtibels full of young men studying. But on the whole, the traditional community was on the defensive and losing ground. In an effort to save the remnant, yeshivas were organized, creating supportive environments with teachers and mashgichim, spiritual guides, to protect students from the corrosive influences of the political and ideological movements active in the Jewish community. In earlier times, in early generations, as Rabbi Gold says here, young men would study in the Beit Midrash. There was not a formal, organized yeshiva. In the interwar period, however, there were dozens and dozens of Hasidic yeshivas that were set up by various Hasidic dynasties and groups. One good example is that of the Rebbe of Alexander, the Alexander Hasidim. This was the group of my late father-in-law. And Rabbi Danziger, Yitzchak Menachem Danziger, who was the Rebbe at this time and died in the Holocaust, he set up a whole series of yeshivot for his younger Hasidim. And here you see some of the publications that were put out by these yeshivot. And in the next slide, we see one which I think is the most important of them, it was a one-time publication in 1939 called Nehor Shraga, in which there is an ongoing discussion of the activities of the various yeshivot. What are they doing? What are they accomplishing? And what are their challenges? And so in this same one-time publication, we have a report where you see it has the title Avodatenu, our work. And it says there, Torah study, which in earlier times had been centered in the Beit Midrash in every city and town, in our time has moved to the holy yeshivot and Torah institutions that have been founded. And here I emphasize, which are the sole spiritual fortresses of our nation. This is a totally new concept in the Hasidic world. To unite the young men under the banner of Torah and Hasidism, according to fixed bylaws by which they may be strengthened in Torah and worship without being swept away by the currents of the time. In other words, to create a protective and protected environment in the yeshiva without the temptations of the outside society. And the ultimate example of this setting up of a Hasidic-oriented yeshiva was what we could call the chief yeshiva of at least central and western Poland, and that is the yeshiva in Lublin, Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, which had a modern building, dormitory, even had a special model of the Second Temple, and attracted both students and supporters from all over the world. And this was the project of Rabbi Meir Shapira, who was the founder of the yeshiva, and his successors kept on that tradition, and the building can still be seen today in Lublin and has been given back to the Jewish community, but for many years it functioned as a nursing school as part of the local university. And on the right you have a certificate of Tzurva Me'Ravanan, a Torah scholar, which was given to one of the graduates of the yeshiva. I should say that the entrance requirements for this yeshiva were very high. A student had to be tested on 200 pages of Gemara in order to get into the yeshiva. And that's, of course, this was a really elite institution. But there were others active in setting up yeshivot, people who came even from abroad. The most interesting example is the so-called Novarodok Musar yeshivot. Novarodok was the most strict of the Musar movement, and many of them had been persecuted in the Soviet Union and made their way into Poland, crossing the border illegally, and working on what we call a missionary attitude of setting up yeshivot for young people in many, many Polish towns, the so-called Beit Yosef yeshivot. And if you look in many, many of the Yizkor books, those who saw the bibliography which I sent, there is a link to the Yizkor books on the site of the National Yiddish Book Center and the New York Public Library. And in many, many towns, when they talk about the yeshivot, you will see pictures like the ones here of these yeshivot Beit Yosef. And there were others who could, as we would say, go on the offensive. One of the most notable was the Baba Rebbe, Rabbi Ben Zion Halberstam. And here I quote Aaron Zev Eshkoli in his survey about Hasidism in Poland. He says one of the Galician Rebbes, the Rebbe of Bobov, became a sort of youth leader, and young men from all over Poland fled their parents' homes and came to Bobov and yeshiva as in the first days of Hasidism in Poland. That's Eshkoli with his kind of historical perspective, which is interesting, but again, look what he calls the Rebbe of Bobov, a youth leader. Again, this emphasis on the youth, the younger generation. And we have the testimony from someone who entered the YIVO Youth Autobiography Contest in the middle and late 30s. And he talked about his attraction to the Baba Rebbe and Baba Hasidism. He says, they did not have to work very hard to attract me to Baba Hasidism, because the Baba Rebbe impressed me greatly by the order and the regime he carried out, especially in his contact with the youth, to the point that he attracted them and succeeded in bringing back to religion many students. So Baba Rebbe was one of the pioneers of what we call today Kiruv work, but he carried this out in interwar Poland. And another student's memoir, written after the war, says, against what was accepted then in the Hasidic world, he began to draw near to him the youth. And when one of his Hasidim would come to him with his son, he would neglect the father and carry on a loving conversation with the young son. Thus, the number of his students grew from day to day. And I could have brought here for the PowerPoint also many newspaper articles when newspaper correspondents, particularly the Yiddish press, would make their way to Bobov on one of the holidays and write about what they saw there in the Rebbe's court. And every one of them mentioned the question about the youth and how the youth were given special attention. Another aspect of the religious struggle and work in the interwar period was what we could call spiritual renewal. And one of the most prominent figures was, again, the Rabbi of Piaseczna, Kalanimus Kalmish Shapiro, who thought that there was a possibility for theological and spiritual renewal based on encouraging the individual to reach his spiritual potential, even to the point of achieving prophecy or Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And the Rebbe of Piaseczna was mostly an educator, and he spent not that much time in his Hasidic court, but more with the students. And he wrote a number of books, only one of them published in the interwar period itself, the second one from the left, called Chovat HaTalmidim, which is a wonderful, sensitive portrayal of what it is to be a student, but no less what it is to be a parent and what it is to be a teacher. And he was really an educator par excellence. And as you can see, the second one from the right is the translation of that book into English. And on the right, another book that was published again after the war called Hachsharat HaAvrechim. Again, preparation of the yeshiva student. Again, looking to how the yeshiva student should be, should educate himself, should act. And he asks a rhetorical question, which I have at the bottom of the slide. He says, should we be satisfied with a small cadre of students in our yeshivot? Is this the entire people of Israel? In other words, his vision, he thought, had implications for the entire Jewish people. Probably the most famous of his writings, however, was written during the dark days of the Holocaust in the Warsaw Ghetto. And on the left, you see Daniel Reiser's wonderful edition of that book. Earlier, the book was published under the title Eish Kodesh, which does not seem to be the actual title of the book. So he called his version Drashot Mishat Hazam, sermons from the time of anger. And these were preserved as part of the Ringelblum archive and were unearthed after the war and have given us a precious legacy. And again, I commend Reiser's edition, which is very much worth consulting to see this classic work by the Piaseczna Rebbe. And there was another figure, just as famous, even more famous than the Piaseczna Rebbe at the time, and that was Hillel Zeitlin, who underwent many changes and metamorphoses in his life, but toward the end of his life became very, very attached to tradition. And you can see his picture there on the right. He really looks like a traditional Jew. Pictures from his younger years don't exactly look like that. But Zeitlin combined both sensitivity to what was going on in society and a devotion to Jewish learning, and combined the two in his 2 weekly columns in the Yiddish paper Der Moment. And just one of them here, you see the Großer Ruf von der Schau, the great call of the hour, where he talks about the need for spiritual renewal. We have to go back to Yavne, he says, but not the Yavne the way people claim it is today. And so we have the quote at the bottom from his article. At present, official orthodoxy stands screaming, "Go back, Jews! Go back into the fortresses of Yavne." But how can these screams help? If the Jewish masses had felt comfortable and content in their fortresses, they never would have fled in the first place. And Zeitlin tried to set up a youth group called Yavne, which didn't really get off the ground, but he wrote much about the needs of the youth. And he also wrote much about the need for seeking spiritual solace in Jewish tradition. He put out editions of essays on Hasidism, on the Zohar, and many other writings, besides his twice weekly newspaper column. So he brought much to the religious discourse of the interwar period, and many of his writings, I think, can have great meaning and impact to this day. But they're all mostly in Yiddish in these newspaper articles, but some of his books were translated into Hebrew as well. And there are other newcomers to Poland, besides those who fled the Soviet Union and started the Musar yeshivas, and that was Chabad, which had a certain small presence in Poland from the 1920s onward, but its significance grew with the coming of the Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson in the 1930s, who came first to Warsaw and then moved to the resort town of Otwock, not far from Warsaw, and there the Lubavitcher Yeshiva existed. And Chabad did attract some people from outside Chabad circles. But what's also interesting is that Chabad also undergoes a certain transformation. And a good example of this, we're going to talk about women in a few minutes, but a good example of this is the Rebbe who had escaped the Soviet Union, spent some years in Riga in Latvia, and then came to Poland. He carried on correspondence with a group of young women who looked for spiritual guidance, and he actually advised them, gave them a certain study list of books, including Hasidic books, things which had usually been outside the realm of women's studies, but he saw women as a spiritual force in their own right. And this whole tradition would be carried further and developed even further by his successor, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, in the United States. But the roots of it, the roots of the change of the attitude toward women, we could even say, were women considered Hasidim or not? In the 19th century, the answer would have usually been no. But in the 20th century, we find some signs that women are regarded as full-fledged members of the Hasidic community and not a kind of ladies' auxiliary. And one of the most obvious places of this is in Chabad. Another group of newcomers to Poland were the Hasidei Bratslav. The Rebbe's grave, the grave of Rebbe Nachman in Uman, which today many people make pilgrimage, particularly on Rosh Hashanah. But in the Soviet Union, this was impossible with the persecution of religion. And some of the Bratslav Hasidim moved their location of their holy gathering during the high holidays to Lublin. And there was a Polish Jew by the name of Yitzchak Reiter who had earlier made contact with Bratslav Hasidim in Russia. And in the interwar period, he arranged to publish some of their works and also helped organize this setting up of a kind of alternate place of pilgrimage in Lublin. They lodged and prayed in the spacious halls of the Chachmei Lublin Yeshiva, which we saw before, enjoying the hospitality of its principal, Meir Shapira, himself a Hasidic Rebbe. And this spiritual devotion of the Bratslav Hasidim in Poland, there's a famous quote from Ringelblum's Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto, where he notes in 1941 that in the prayer house of the Hasidim of Bratslav on Novolipia Street, there was a large sign, Jews, never despair, the kind of motto of Bratslav Hasidim. The Hasidim danced there with the same religious fervor as before the war. And this is the observation of Ringelblum, who was a secular Jew, but saw something in this religious fervor of the Bratslav Hasidim, even in the conditions of the ghetto. And there was another form of spiritual renewal in this period, of Orthodox initiative, and that is in the realm of religious literature, poetry and prose. For one good example of one of the fine examples produced in this period was the book of poems published by the young Abraham Yehoshua Heschel, who would become famous much later, of course, where he wrote a book of Yiddish poems called Der Shem HaMeforash Mensch. And there are all kinds of interpretations given to what the name of the book means, but we'll just leave it for the second. And he says poems. And then just one example of one of the poems, he has a poem called Help, which we can see the germ of much of the theological approach that Heschel would adopt many decades later. But it's already here evident in his poetry written as a young man. Just a section from the poem, which is a very meaningful and very moving poem. Set me at the head of all the dying, that is, those who are going to die, with a greeting, a message from you, the desolate call to you, and you don't come. So send me and others you might choose. You are meant to help here, O God, but you are silent while needs shriek. So help me to help. I'll fulfill your duty. Pay your debts. And there are many, many other creative writers at this time. One I might mention is a writer who wrote under the pen name Alter Schnur, who published a large number of poems spread out in Orthodox periodicals. That's one of the problems we have about getting to know this literature, because many of the writings of these Orthodox writers are just spread out in periodicals. Many of them we don't even have copies anymore. But there was this phenomenon of Orthodox literature in Yiddish and in Hebrew. And as we mentioned before when we talked about Chabad, but the larger issue of women and religious women in this interwar period. Deborah Weissman, in her pioneering MA thesis from the 1970s, talked about the Beis Yaakov movement. And she says, again, the question which always plagues us in dealing with the interwar period, what if? Had the natural life cycle of the movement not been truncated by the horrors of the Holocaust, the somewhat proto-feminist trends present in the 1920s and 1930s might have developed in interesting ways. The educational ideal of the Beis Yaakov girl was an Orthodox Jewish woman, married and the mother of children, who nevertheless developed a career outside the home and continued being involved in Torah study and the fulfillment of mitzvot and good deeds. The economic necessity of work outside the home seemed to give way to a more positive view of work as something to be affirmed in and of itself. The kinds of occupations for which the girls were trained, including teaching, secretarial work, bookkeeping, and later even medical and legal secretaries, were held up as models. Academic degrees were generally frowned upon, even in the US. So she talks about a new concept of the Orthodox Jewish woman, which is centered in the Beis Yaakov movement. And there are several key figures in the development of Beis Yaakov movement. First and foremost, that of Sarah Schenirer, whose picture we'll see in the next slide. But here we see a propaganda pamphlet that she prepared. Was darf sein mit der jüdische Tochter? What's going to be, what should be with the Jewish daughter? And Sarah Schenirer, who founded the first Beis Yaakov school in Krakow, went around the country also as a kind of missionary, a missionary for setting up these schools for girls. And she would go from town to town, and this relatively uneducated woman would electrify the crowds, and in many cases they would immediately decide to set up a Beis Yaakov school following the example set by Sarah Schenirer. The capstone of the Beis Yaakov movement in Poland was the seminary in Krakow, which had an impressive building. Here we see the seminary students at their summer retreat, where again, for spiritual regeneration, getting some fresh air out of the big city, at the retreat town of Rabka. There were three individuals who left the greatest stamp upon the Beis Yaakov seminary and, by extension, the Beis Yaakov movement as a whole. There was Dr. Leo Deutschlander, who was a German Jew from the Hirschian Toraim Derech Eretz school. There was Sarah Schenirer herself. And later, after the death of Sarah Schenirer and the death of Deutschlander, Yehuda Leib Orlean took over as principal of the seminary. Each one of these individuals had a different philosophy of education, had a different view of what the curriculum should be, and there are no small arguments and disagreements among them, but they agreed on the basics of what the Beis Yaakov girl should be. And lately, we've found some new sources. We're waiting for the publication of Sarah Schneerer's Polish diary, which she wrote as a young woman, which has been promised to appear for several years now and should appear this year, I hope. And the writings of Orlean about Jewish education, and Deutschlander's articles, many in German, published in different German Orthodox publications. We can get a deeper idea of what was happening. And we are also fortunate that in very, very recent years, a diary of a student in the Beis Yaakov seminary in Hebrew was published, and several scholars are now working on this diary, and it's a treasure trove of observations, close observations of these three individuals and the effect that they had on them and the disagreements that they had. And also the different backgrounds of the students in the Beis Yaakov seminary, the Hasidic girls having one kind of nature and the girls from the so-called Litvish area having a different one. This particular student who wrote the diary in Hebrew had actually gone to a Tarbut high school, but then her father convinced her to go to the Beis Yaakov seminary, where she could become a teacher of religion. And another way that Beis Yaakov got its message across to the wider Jewish public was through their Beis Yaakov journal, which was published from the early 1920s up until 1939. Here you can see issue number 3 from 1924, the Beis Yaakov journal. And notice also that it had a Polish edition, an additional part called Wschód, which means the East, regarding the questions of Jewry. This Polish supplement disappeared after a few years as Beis Yaakov came to emphasize more and more the Yiddish language. But there was a message getting across to the Jewish public through this publication, which was widely circulated. And again, this was an Orthodox response to the many, many publications of secular Jewish movements. Connected to the Beis Yaakov schools, and there were many of them. Here on the left you see a picture which is clearly mislabeled. It says Beis Yaakov School in Krakow, but if one looks up above, it says the Beis Yaakov School in Kielce, but we won't quibble about that. But there was also the Benot Agudat Yisrael, or Benos Agudas Yisrael, the youth movement for girls, along with the Tzirei Agudat Yisrael, the youth movement for boys, and the Poalei Agudat Yisrael, workers' movement. And here you see the Benot Agudat Yisrael youth movement again, but look how old these girls look. They don't look like children, certainly not. This was a real young women's organization, and it was apolitical, as opposed to other organizations connected to Agudat Yisrael. Sorry, I went the wrong way. How do we sum up? What was the success? What was the failure of these reactions and initiatives by the religious sector? I didn't talk too much about the Mizrahi, which of course is also very important in this. And I recommend once again my student Asaf Kaniel's book on the Mizrahi movement in interwar Poland, and also the doctoral dissertation of my student Yochanan Ben Yaakov, which has not been published yet, about the Hashomer Hadati in interwar Poland. So there was the development of what we call a certain type of modern orthodoxy, but it was mostly aiming at Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. But like other things we talked about the interwar period, there's always the what-if factor. How would things have played out in the long run? Was the religious renewal that Zeitlin and the Rebbe of Piaseczna talked about likely or possible? It's really impossible to know. But religion was still active in Jewish society, even if other ideologies were more prominent. Even in the political sphere, we should remember that Agudat Yisrael was the second largest Jewish party, with the second largest representation in the Polish parliament after the General Zionists. So that it was still there. It was still part of the Jewish faction in the Polish Sejm, the Polish parliament. And again, the key word is organization. Almost all of the things we talked about demanded some kind of organization of the Orthodox community. To take one prominent example, you can see on the bottom the cover of the fine book by Ben-Zion Klibansky called Ketzur Chalamish, and the subtitle is Tor HaZahav Shel HaYeshivot HaLitaiyot Bepolin. And Golden Age, he talks about the growth of the yeshivot, but also he talks about the fact that the yeshivot could get together and create a central organization for raising funds. Because how did these yeshivot exist? They had some local patrons, of course. There was money that came from the Joint Distribution Committee in America. And there were also organizations of Landsleit, people who came from a particular town, who the rabbi of the town would solicit, either by mail or even going in person. Some of the rabbis, such as Reb Meir Shapiro, went to America for a couple of years to raise money for the Lublin yeshiva, and other rabbis, such as Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who had his yeshiva in Baranovich. He went to America for several years to raise money for the yeshiva. But the Landsleit were also an important source of support for the yeshivot. But I don't want you to get the idea that this was a simple or easy process to fund these yeshivot, because it wasn't. Yeshiva students lived a very minimal, even poor existence. It's mentioned in several memoirs, for example, that yeshiva students in Warsaw were not housed, they didn't have a dormitory, and not every family was willing to take in yeshiva students. So what some yeshiva students did was they volunteered to be night watchmen in Jewish factories that were closed during the night, and they promised to keep watch in exchange for being able to sleep on a bench or something inside the closed factory. So this was not an easy existence. But organization did help and managed to keep most of the yeshivot above water. Of course, Klibanski called this the golden age of the Lithuanian yeshivot in Poland, but even he retreats a bit from his subtitle of his book at the very, very conclusion of his very fine book by saying that, you know, actually, it might not have been so golden, that the more senior yeshiva students, the numbers were okay, but not growing so much. The younger yeshiva students, the numbers were growing, but there were not always places for them to go to continue. So that there were real problems, financial and otherwise, with the yeshivot. But another thing we saw in tonight's lecture was the development of tools and concepts that recognize youth as a special period of life with special problems, with special needs, and needed special encouragement to keep them within the fold of orthodoxy, such as the Hasidic yeshivot. And I think that this young Orthodox generation is worthy of scholarly attention as part of the larger narrative on the interwar generation that we talked about last time. That if we compare the yeshiva students and members of youth movements, other youth movements, of people going to secular Jewish schools, there still is a common language of a youth world which was separate from that of parents. For Orthodox youth, it was less the alienation that was expressed by some of the other, more secular youth, but nevertheless there was a feeling that our generation has special needs, and what is going to be with our generation. So if we sum up, there was still vitality in the Orthodox sector. It was from a third to a half of Polish Jewry, had organizations, produced literature of worth, periodicals of worth to this day, and unique spiritual individuals that offered inspiration, not just for that generation, but even for generations to come. So I thank you all for your attention, and it was a pleasure being here with you for these 4 lectures at Beit Avichai.
Thank you very much, Gershon. And I don't know if I speak for everyone, but I think many people are used to referring to the Jews of Poland only in relevance to the Holocaust, and taking us back to their history and seeing how rich a life was there just makes it maybe even more tragic, but we learned so much information in this series, so thank you very much. And we do have a few questions came up here.
Yes.
Okay. Tzvi wants to know if you could speak about the Chabad schools whose founding predated Beis Yaakov, but they don't get as much attention from historians and the public.
Well, I can mention a little bit about it. That goes back to the World War I period, when much of Poland was occupied by the Germans. And the Germans were interested in Jewish education, interested in the Jews. They saw the Jews as a possible pro-German element in Polish society. And there were initiatives by German Orthodox rabbis. Some of them were army chaplains in the German army. Some of them were civilian rabbis who came to Poland and were active in organizing both Agudat Yisrael, and the early schools for girls and for boys, the Chabad was for girls, in those years of World War I. So it is a part of the history of Orthodoxy, but we were talking tonight about the interwar period, and they were not as important as the major school networks that were set up afterwards. But they certainly existed and are worthy of mention, and I thank the questioner.
Okay. Was the Lublin Yeshiva the first non-Hasidic yeshiva?
Hasidic yeshiva. It was Hasidic. It was not non-Hasidic.
Okay.
That was the whole point, that this was the Hasidic yeshiva for the more Hasidic area of Poland. There were many, many yeshivot in Polish Lithuania and in independent Lithuania in the interwar period. But this was the first major Hasidic yeshiva. There were some other Hasidic yeshivas, we saw the ones of Alexander and others that were set up, but this was a kind of, how should I put it, kind of Harvard of yeshivot in Poland, and it was a mark of great respect to be a student and a graduate of the Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin. I remember the former president of Bar Ilan University, Professor Kaveh, who showed me how his father was a student at the Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, and he showed me the list of the students with his father's name. And when he came to Israel, his father, one of his jobs was to test people who wanted to get an exemption from army draft because they were yeshiva students, and he would test them on Gemara just to see where they were. And this was a graduate of Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin.
Okay. There was a question at the beginning from Zisi. She wanted to know, didn't the Gerer Rebbe also support Mizrahi originally?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But the Gerer Rebbe, we have to say, was very interested in settling in Eretz Yisrael. He encouraged his followers. He made 3 trips to Eretz Yisrael in the interwar period. He encouraged his followers to buy land, to set up businesses. And thanks to that, there was a nucleus of a Gerer Hasidic community in Eretz Yisrael before the Holocaust hit. And so that was very important. So he was a Zionist, in a sense, but not affiliated with the Zionist movement. The Alexander Hasidim, who I mentioned, who were probably the second largest Hasidic group in central Poland, they had a kind of off-again, on-again relationship with the Mizrahi movement. And at the beginning, the Alexander Rebbe actually was one of the signatories for setting up Agudat Yisrael. But then he split with them, and oftentimes the Alexander Hasidim would support the Mizrahi and religious Zionism.
Okay, some of the questions here are very, very big, but I'll ask you maybe a last question and see if you can answer it in a few words. Michelle would like to know, what is the difference between Hasidism and Chabad?
Chabad is one type of Hasidism. That's the simplest answer. It developed in the late 18th, early 19th century. It's one of the most veteran Hasidic groups, but it's one of many, many Hasidic groups, probably the most well-known outside of Hasidic society, in Western society, but it's one type of Hasidism, but not the only type, far from it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gershon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And if you enjoy learning Jewish history, next week we're starting a new series with Professor Eli Lederhendler, who is taking us away from Poland and maybe along with some of the Jews who left Poland and decided to immigrate to New York. And we'll be studying the Jews of New York through a 4-part series. So please feel free to join us. And from next week, we're back to 1 p.m. EST. This was just 1 week where Israel changed the clock before the rest of the world. So back to the usual times. And thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.